A few weeks ago, I turned on the TV and happened to find a movie that looked interesting. It took me a few minutes before I realized that movie was almost over. I watched the ending, and although I had trouble figuring out who the characters were or what was going on, afterwards I said to myself, that might have looked like a good movie. I should rent it and maybe watch it from the beginning. Anyone who reads the New Testament will soon find themselves saying the same thing about the Old Testament. That's because the New Testament makes so many references to the Old Testament, quoting authors, referencing historical events, building on theological ideas that are first introduced in the Old Testament. In fact, it's impossible to understand the ministry of Jesus without knowing the Old Testament, since all of the main events of Jesus' ministry took place during religious festivals that are pre-described in the Old Testament. Without some of the knowledge of its background, it is impossible to understand the New Testament. I know many Christians avoid the Old Testament. I'll admit that some of the cultural customs and medical laws are difficult to see how this ancient and undeveloped culture could have anything important to say to us. But if we read the stories closely, we'll see that this ancient people understood some things about life and God better than us modern people. They didn't have a modern lifestyle, but at their core, they were just like you and me. They wanted it to be loved and respected. They wanted to prosper and feel secure, and they struggled with the same things that we struggle with today, like relationships, insecurity, sexual desire, and anger and fear. And most importantly, they wanted to have a relationship with their loving Creator. Because until we have a relationship with that one that made us, we'll always be frustrated and confused, just like you and me. So what do we do when we come across one of those passages that are hard to understand? Let me give you two quick questions that will help you unlock the meaning of the Old Testament. First question, ask yourself, what did this story mean there and then? Before you can understand the story means here and now, you have to know what it meant to the person who was there. This means that you're going to have to look for historical and cultural clues and ask, what are they facing? Then ask and use your imagination and ask, what are they feeling? Finally, you have to look back at the story and ask, how did God address it? Once you know there and then, it's fairly easy to apply to the here and now. Second question, ask yourself, how does the New Testament complete this idea? The New Testament explains and expands on every important Old Testament story and idea so that we know that the Old Testament says about certain topics. Some Old Testament ideas are confirmed in the New Testament with no changes, such as creation and marriage, while other ideas are greatly expanded, like redemption and holiness. Ultimately, we have to remember that Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment and promise of the New Testament laws and promises. Those two simple questions will unlock the Old Testament for you. What did it mean there and then? And how is it completed in the New Testament?